everybody. Hello and welcome to this fantastic event, A Path Toward Equitable Housing, Reimagining Ontario's Rental Market. Thank you so much to our guests who are joining us here in person. I am Alex Venuto, the Deputy Director of the World Urban Pavilion. I will be moderating today's session with our fantastic panel of speakers. We also have several individuals joining us online as well, so thank you so much for those of us joining us virtually, as well as one of our colleagues who's also speaking, as you can see here on the screen as well. Nanor, I just want to double check that you can hear me okay. Okay, she's nodding her head up and down. Fantastic.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Nanor. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on Reimagining Ontario's rental market. We're here today not just to have a conversation, but to strengthen our network, elevate our collective voice, and advocate for change we so desperately need. This is about talking about action to address the evolving landscape of Ontario's rental market, and also understanding other models that are happening around the globe as well, and things that we can learn so that we can envision what is truly possible moving forward. As I'm sure many of us here know today, over the past few decades, we've witnessed significant changes in the rules and regulations that govern renters. Some of these changes have been beneficial, creating more safeguards for tenants, but also others have slowly chipped away at our sense of community and our right to affordable, secure housing. These changes have had repercussions that stretch far beyond just the individual renters, but they also affect our families, our community, and the very fabric of our cities as well. When we're talking about cities, this is crucial for where you are today, the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. The Pavilion is a global knowledge exchange hub for sustainable urbanization and best practices. And we have a lot of discussions and a lot of actions that we discuss when it comes to housing, affordable housing, and the different models and components related to that as well. However, the truth is that housing is more than just a roof over our heads. It is also the foundation of our well-being, the cornerstone of a healthy community, and a critical component of a fair and equitable society. And yet access to affordable housing is becoming increasingly out of reach for many across Ontario, across Canada, and frankly, across the globe. So this session aims to change that narrative, to bring forth new perspectives, fresh solutions, and a bold vision for what our rental market can and should be. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to have an outstanding lineup of speakers who will guide us through some of the changes we're facing and explore the opportunities that lie ahead. We'll first hear from Nanor Agagorzian. We'll dive into the rental models across Canada and other parts of the world, giving us insights into how different jurisdictions are tackling similar issues and what we can learn from them. After that, we'll hear from Jordy Dent, who's the Executive Director from the Federation of Metro Tenants Association, who will address the current landscape for renters in Ontario, highlighting the key challenges and opportunities that exist, and now what needs to be done to strengthen renter rights. And my apologies, Nanor, I didn't introduce your title. Nanor is from UN Habitat, a data specialist on sustainable development goal localization and local governments team, and also with UN Habitat headquarters, and also an urban analysis and development expert with UN Habitat in Lebanon. So it's very exciting to have this global perspective here as well. Following Jordy's remarks, we'll hear from MPP Putila Karafosha, who will speak about the fairness of Ontario's rental market, providing some insights on ongoing legislative efforts and the importance of ensuring Ontario renters are treated fairly and equitably under the law. And then finally, we'll hear from Jocelyn Race Midgell, who's the president of the High Park Tenants Association. I work very closely with Jocelyn. I'm also the vice president of the High Park Tenants Association. And honestly, ever since Jocelyn joined the High Park Tenants Association, we've been much more engaged in our community. So props to Jocelyn on that. And she'll focus on communities as collaborative spaces on how we can foster stronger, more resilient neighborhoods where renters are empowered and engaged. So this session is meant to spark ideas, encourage dialogue, and most importantly, inspire action. The future of Ontario's rental market doesn't just depend on policymakers or experts, but it depends on each of us. So what can we do to support this narrative as we move forward? And before we begin, I just want to highlight that we'll also be opening the floor later on to the session to hearing from each of you, both virtually and here in person. We want to hear your ideas. We want to hear your concerns, your vision for the rental market. And we want to get everyone here engaged in the work that we're all collectively doing. So let's take this opportunity to learn, to connect, and to push for a rental market that serves the needs of all Ontarians, not just the privileged few. Together, we can reimagine a system that prioritizes affordability, fairness, and community, a system that makes a difference not only today, but for the future generations. So without much further ado, I will turn to you, Nanar, who will open up our first remarks. Please, Nanar, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me to present today. I have been with the UN Habitat since 2018. I'm not a housing specialist, however, housing, including rental housing, has been a topic that has been addressed in many of the projects that I've managed, mostly related to research and normative components. Just want to check if you can see my screen.
Yes, Anna.
Yes. So I've dealt with the issue of housing and rental housing, while working with UN Habitat Lebanon, and also more recently with the headquarters in the SDG localization and local governments team. So I will present what I will present today is based on a review of the literature that I conducted, but also some perspectives or insights I've gained from my experience at UN Habitat, as well as personal insights. As someone who has rented apartments or houses in different parts of the world, including Greece, the United Kingdom, Lebanon, and more recently since last year in Canada. The aim of my presentation is to frame the topic of rental housing, to present the different components of this complex puzzle. But before doing so, I'd like to touch upon two important points. One has to do with the difficulty of making comparisons across countries and even within countries. And the second is how widespread is really renting as a housing tenure type in the world. With regard to the first point, it's very difficult to make comparisons and to make general statements that apply to all countries or to many countries or even to different localities within countries. And that's for a number of reasons, one of them being the lack of updated or comprehensive data, for example, for similar periods of time, or of longitudinal data that would allow us to do trend analysis. The lack of data is especially accentuated in developing countries like Lebanon, for example, and also at the local level. So we often have, for example, data at the national level, which obscures some of the intricacies or nuances that exist at the local level. The difficulty of comparisons also exists because of inconsistency in definitions, in methodologies of data collection and analysis, indicators, thresholds that are used, for example, to define different aspects of rental housing and housing in general. So having said this, you'll see that it's very hard to make very general statements. However, there are certain characteristics that we could highlight for different countries or different contexts. When it comes to answering this question, how widespread is renting as a housing tenure type? Again, there is large variation between and within countries. As one UN Habitat report puts it, renting is generally an urban tenure. So obviously, as we know, it usually exists in cities because in rural areas, ownership or free access to housing is more common. But there are differences between cities depending on a number of factors, like city size, with metropolitan cities usually having higher levels of renters compared to smaller cities. This applies to the United States, to Canada, to China, Colombia, and other countries. And also other factors like the nature of local land market, topography, the proportion of recent migrants, and so on. So just as an example from Lebanon, for example, there are two neighborhoods, one in Tripoli, in the north of the country, where there is 35% of households renting their houses, versus another neighborhood near Beirut, Marash, which you can see to the right, where almost 85% of households rent. So there is really great variation there. Here I've put some figures from different countries that show the proportion of renters as a share of all households. Again, as you can see, percentages vary from, for example, over 60% in Switzerland, as you can see, to countries where the proportion of renters is lower, like in India or Thailand, and so on. Now, having said this, I tried to create this very simple illustration, which I'm sure lacks a lot of detail and nuances, but I just wanted to have it there to help me in the presentation. And I will touch upon the different components of the rental housing system that this shows. So we have the supply side, the owners, the demand side, the tenants, the rental housing structures that they supply and use, and their types and characteristics, which are linked to different issues like the quality of housing, the costs and affordability issues, also relationships between owners and tenants, and the stability of tenure issues that arise from those. And of course, there are policies that regulate more the demand side, the supply side, or other aspects of the system. And this whole thing occurring, of course, in a local and national context, including institutional and legal frameworks related to the financial institutions, the private sector, and other relevant laws, and within, of course, a global context with its economic, social, ecological, and political challenges. So I will try to divide this complex puzzle into pieces and give some examples from different countries so we can understand the diversity that exists. So from the supply side, the owners, we have different typologies of owners. Some are more prominent in some countries versus others. The most common in most countries is small-scale owners. In Mexico, for example, individuals own around 70% of all rental units. In the United States, it's more than half. In Germany and France, it's over 60 and 50% respectively. These owners usually are rent, because rent is an important income source, even a survival strategy for some of them. There is a bit more tendency to have informal transactions or informal operations in the case of small-scale owners for different reasons, to avoid taxes or regulations, or because the unit itself is informal, like in this is the case in many Latin American countries and sub-Saharan African countries, but also elsewhere, even in more developed contexts. We have then more institutional owners, such as commercial owners, which have larger scale and more formal operations. Usually, they're usually longer-term investors who monitor more closely their risks and rates of return. In the United States, for example, around 30% of the residential rental real estate is controlled by large corporate entities. We have public sector owners, either at the center or local government level, that they provide accommodation, rental accommodation, either to their employees or also or to the urban poor at large. This has become less common than it used to be, but it still exists in many countries like China, India, the United States, and other countries. We have social owners, different non-profit making organizations like charities, housing associations like the one in the Netherlands, as you can see, that provide social rental housing, that basically provide housing to targeted groups, usually the poor, but not entirely. And we have employer owners that provide accommodation for their employees, hospitals, universities, the military, civil servants, and so on. From the tenant side, again, it's sometimes hard to make generalizations, but there are certain trends, or there are commonalities across different countries that we could highlight. So one is renting is usually more common among those with lower incomes. As we can see, for example, here, some figures from a study focusing on 12 countries in Europe and North America. This is the case. Among migrants, again, I will not focus, of course, on all of these figures, but we can go back if you're interested. So among foreign-born households, more likely to be renters than native households, as the study calls them. Among younger people, so age matters, and also household size, with single parent households being more likely to be renters, and of course people with different priorities, like those, for example, who want to save for setting up businesses elsewhere. We can also divide tenants by constraint, which are the greater number in most contexts, that become renters for different reasons, like income difficulties, or also other reasons like race, religion, family size, circumstances, and so on. And also by choice. They are less numerous for different reasons, like mobility, to move between jobs and therefore changing their houses accordingly, flexibility, freedom for making long-term financial commitments that usually come with home ownership, especially mortgages, and also even remittances. They prefer to send remittances back home, or even to save money to buy a house elsewhere. Now, in terms of the types and characteristics of structures, again, there is a huge variation between different countries in terms of the type of structures. So as you can see in this graph, for example, in most of the countries that are analyzed, except for the UK, multifamily structures accounted for the largest share of rental units. Also, in terms of the size of the rental units, based on this study, for example, the US, followed by Canada and Switzerland, having the larger median unit sizes. In terms of number of rooms and number of people per room, which is an indicator of overcrowding. In some countries, like Sweden, having single room rental units a bit more common than in other countries, which are becoming rarer, like in Canada, the United States, and other European countries. And of course, the age of the structure, again, based on this study, Canada and Spain being the countries with the youngest rental housing stock. All of these, of course, are related to the quality of the structures, and to the cost of the structures, which I will touch upon a bit more extensively in a bit. But before saying that, again, there is great variation in terms of the stability of tenure, in terms of, for example, how widespread informal housing is, how widespread risks are to tenants in terms of eviction and displacement, loss of security deposit, and the degree of protection against some of these risks. Also, in terms of the dispute resolution mechanisms that exist in different countries and different cities, in certain contexts, especially developed countries, having greater legal protections, but still coming with high legal and court costs that make the whole process costly and time-consuming. In terms of affordability, a big issue in many countries, including in Canada, which according to CMHC, it is the predominant issue, putting both renter and owner households in core housing need. So this is, again, these are some figures that show the median share of gross household income spent on housing, with usually 30% being regarded as a threshold, or as a threshold for affordability in many contexts, like Canada and United States. And of course, there are other affordability indicators that could be analyzed. The affordability problem, It has been recognized globally, as Alex said, in a recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing in August 2023. He talked about, or the report talked about, the global affordable housing crisis, in addition to other, as it's called, massive violations to the right to adequate housing. And of course, as many of you know, the right to adequate housing includes these components according to the 7 components here according to the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and it has been recognized, especially under SDG 11, as a target for Agenda 2030. In terms of policies, so within this context and all of this complex puzzle, what kind of policies have been adopted and where do we stand in terms of rental housing policy? And one thing that has been stressed is that in many studies and reports is that national housing policies, as many of you know or have experienced, it has focused on promoting home ownership. So there is and still is a bias, as it's called in some reports, towards rental housing. And it has been a neglected policy area, as the UN Habitat report puts it, especially until the 2008 mortgage crisis. So there is a need to place rental housing on the urban housing agenda, as a 2011 UN Habitat report puts it, even though that is focused on developing countries, but it applies to many developed contexts as well. And there is a need to do so in an evidence-based manner, and transparent manner, by assessing the system and the sector comprehensively. There is an important role for regional and especially local governments, but in coordination with national governments, noting that, as I said, there are each city is different, so there is no single formula that applies to all. And the importance of non-discriminatory approaches in housing, including rental housing policies, with special attention paid to traditionally marginalized or vulnerable population segments. And I will end my presentation by briefly presenting some of the policies that have been used in different countries to regulate different components of this system, complex system. So there are subsidies or assistance provided, whether in the demand side or supply side. The demand side, it comes in the form, for example, of housing allowances, either directly paid to tenants or to others on behalf of tenants. This is the case in many European countries, for example, or in the form of housing vouchers, like in the United States, to help them basically with housing-related expenses. The supply side has to do with providing subsidies and finance for either individual or institutional owners in order to encourage them to offer low-income rental housing. This can come in different forms. For example, in the UK and in European countries, it has come in the form of different tax reductions or exemptions. For example, in France, to social housing companies. There is also the program in the United States of low-income housing tax credits that is given to businesses or to developers by the government to enable the production or the building of affordable rental housing projects. They may also come in the form of credits, especially microcredits, given usually to small-scale landlords. That's the case, for example, in Norway or Austria. But oftentimes it's a combination of some of these things. So some of these subsidies or loans are provided simultaneously. Then there are different types of regulations that control or related to the rent prices, whether in the form of rent freezes, which existed in Ontario, for example, mainly before 1975, that prohibit rent increases, or also in the form of rent control that limit rent increases by a certain percentage or by structures built before a certain date. This has, for example, affected my own family in Lebanon. There is what we call the old rent law for rental agreements concluded before 1992. And there are also it comes in the form of also exemptions that are given to owners in case of to cover certain costs related to maintenance or upgrades, for example. Then there are different sets of measures related to, for example, improvement of the existing low quality rental housing, or informal settlement or settlement in general, and poor neighborhood upgrading, as well as the improvement of security of tenure for tenants, while trying to balance it with the rental supply side. I'm almost done, Alex. And then finally, the different mechanisms that exist for arbitration. Again, there are a lot of differences in different countries. Of course, I don't have time to go over the advantages and benefits and to conduct an assessment of the success rate of some of these policies. But again, I would like to end my presentation as it's clear, I guess, from most of the slides, that there is no one size fits all approach, and usually a combination of different measures is the preferred approach, depending on the context, both locally and nationally, and also depending on circumstances elsewhere. And also we need to view this within the larger framework of other policies like labor and social policies, to ensure that wages and social security benefits all work together to guarantee an adequate standard of living, including access to adequate housing, as is mentioned in this recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur. I will end my presentation here. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to try to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nanor. And we will get to questions at the end of the presentations here. And it's important what you're discussing, Nanor, because at the World Urban Pavilion, we talk a lot about what is working and what doesn't work across the globe. And Nanor, you provided a very good overview of framework for understanding a lot of the rental challenges that are happening, not just in the developed world, but also the developing world. And when we talk about when we look at what the World Urban Pavilion is doing as well, when it comes to Canada and housing and the sustainable development goals, we really want to try to position Canada as a good example. There's still a lot of work that we need to do when it comes to what Canada is doing when it comes to housing, but there's so much good things that are happening. There's so much powerful people here that can really affect change in communities here as well. And these are important things to learn what is working and what isn't working. Still lots of work to do, and I hope that we hear some of the opportunities and challenges from our next speaker, which is Jordan Dent here.
Don't turn into a Jim Carrey comedy skit here. All right, folks. Hi, my name is Jordy Hanks. I'm the executive director of the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. Quick shout out to a couple of our board members in the audience. We got Laura at the back. Hello, Laura. We have Sharon at the top there too. Thank you to our awesome members of the board showing up, representing their communities. I think Alex had mentioned there's some good and bad things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bad things. And you all know what the bad things are. If any of you rent in the city of Toronto, you'll know the state of the market. It is bad. It's not a good scenario. I've got 3 things to talk about today. And the second thing is 4 dates. So 3 things in 4 days. First thing I want to talk about is this. Why do we have rent control? Why? Why do we have rent control? What does rent control do? It does 2 main things. Any renters here? What does it do? So lady in the back, the glasses.
It prevents the prices from going too high, too fast.
It prevents price gouging. Absolutely. All right. We've all been through this. There was a study done in San Francisco a couple of years ago. It looked at the amount of savings you normally get from having rent control. And it concluded it was about $2,400 to $6,000 a year. Anyone want an extra $2,400 to $6,000? I think we all do. So again, it prevents the landlords from gouging you. The second thing it prevents is what we call economic evictions. There was a story last year around two sisters who were in a unit that wasn't rent controlled. Their landlord was just not doing maintenance. So they were getting ready to sign a new lease and said, look, we'll sign this new lease. Can you promise that you'll do maintenance, which you are legally supposed to do? And the landlord responded by giving them a $7,500 a month rent increase. Now, again, he knew they're not going to pay that. He knew they're just going to be thrown into the streets, which is exactly the point. Hey, can we enforce our rights? Your rights, $7,500 a month extra. That's my right as a landlord. Again, these things are horrible. All right. And I have been fighting an intellectual war for the last 10 years against landlords that say that rent control is another thing. What do you think landlords say about rent control? Ties their hands, so absolutely. They can't gouge you as much as they want. But they also say it does something else. Anyone know? It does something bad socially, they say. It leads to lower rental housing development, they say. There's a small problem with that, is that the last 10 years I've been saying, prove it. And no landlord can. Because even though there's been hundreds of years, hundreds of instances of rent control, there's no actual evidence that it hurts anything. When rent control was expanded in Ontario in 2017, rental housing development went up 3.5 times, 350%. When it was introduced in Berlin, rental development went up. Again, landlords were screaming red in the face, angry about this, but it's the reality. I think mostly landlords, they want to do that rent gouging. Now, the question is, how did we get here? All right, rent gouging is allowed in a lot of scenarios. Market's not doing great, we're living in a housing crisis. Well, I told you there's 4 dates around this. I'm not going to go, sometimes when I do this presentation, I'll go all the way back to probably the worst eviction crisis in Ontario's history, which was colonization, when a lot of Indigenous people just got thrown off their land. But for the purposes of today's speech, I'm going to jump up ahead to the 1940s. 1940s? What happened in the 1940s? What happened in the 1940s is very similar to things that you're seeing today. You had veterans saying, coming back from the war, and they were living in tented camps. For some of the ones that you're going to see in the parks all throughout Ontario today. And they said this is not acceptable. So they did something kind of similar to what people are doing today. They got militants. They occupied the barracks across from 24 Sussex Drive, the Prime Minister's office. And they said, we want you to turn this barracks into supportive housing. And they did the same thing in Vancouver. Hotel Vancouver veterans said, you know what? We're tired of living in tents. This should be bought by the government, and turned into housing that we can afford. You had a huge wave of that, and it led to almost all the housing that we see in Toronto and Ontario today. Almost all this housing was built through the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation supply programs. They basically said, hey, we want to see people building. This is what we want built, and this is where we want it built. And you had massive waves of housing development, all through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then started curtailing in the 80s and 90s, but it was still there. Well, that was one day, 1940s, but then all those great programs came to an end in the second date, 1992. What happened in 1992? The framework for the system that we live in today was laid. And what the government said is not that we're privatizing housing. Most housing is built by private corporations. What they said is we're going to privatize the construction of housing. It used to be CMHC would look at this building and say, before it was constructed, how many 3-bedrooms do you want in that building? How many 5-bedrooms do you want in that building? How many affordable units? How many market rate units? And what kind of interesting blend of tax incentives can we get to that? And what that meant was all those kind of units got built. And what they said in 1992 is, we're going to leave it to the private market. We're going to let them build what they think is best. And guess what? Ever notice how many shoebox condos we got around the city? That's what they thought was best. Why? Because they can sell those to investors. Which leads me to point number 3 and date number 3. 2008. If you look at 2008, it's interesting. Anyone know what happened in 2008? Big global thing? Global recession, big financial crisis. You had billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of investment dollars from the US, Brazil, China, a bunch in Canada, and they were investing in US real estate, which then collapsed. All that money was still there and it had to go into something. Where did it go? Well, it's debatable. But if you ask me, I was looking at housing markets all throughout the world after 2008. And what's interesting is everything that's happening in Canada is also happening in other countries. It's happening in Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, South Africa, Colombia, Bogota is seeing housing prices spike, and all happening at the same time. All those global investment dollars that were around the world soaking into the housing market, running prices up, guess what? They went into real estate. Why? Why was all this money flowing into real estate? Well, you might remember after 2008, interest rates were low, money was cheap. You can get a loan, buy 5 more houses, rent them out, have the equity of your house going up, and then flip it again. Well, there's one more date. 2022, interest rates went up. Party's over. Construction stopped. 25 25 builders are in receivership right now in Ontario. But housing prices are still not going down. Why? Well, right when we're about to get a bunch more supply, when prices again have stalled, they pull the supply. Why? Because the government doesn't build the housing anymore. They privatized it. So the same people that stand to lose their shirt if they build those projects, they pull those projects back. Third point I want to talk to you is where things stand today. All right, where do things stand today? We are unfortunately in this holding pattern. All right, prices aren't going up anymore. The party's over. All those investment dollars that were going into housing aren't going there anymore. And that's good in a way, that froth, that speculative environment where people were just buying a house, selling it a month later to capture the dollars, that's over. But no one's building. No one's building in the way they're supposed to. Now, the Federation and a lot of other housing advocates, we've been beating this drum for 30 years. We've been saying, if you want to, again, bring back lower housing prices, you want to bring back stronger rent control. Actually, the best form of strong rent control is actually just supply. You just flood the market with supply, and again, prices go down because you know what? If you're charging $1,200 for a 1-bedroom, I can get $800 for a 1-bedroom down the road. So everyone's got to bring those prices down. The problem is supply is still privatized. We keep asking the federal government to bring back those programs, and they keep telling us no. Until that's dealt with, until again we bring back supply under our control, we're still going to keep having these problems. But it's doable. One final note that I just want to say is we often talk about kind of the roles of every government. There is roles for every government here, but we have to want to actually build the units. And while there are great politicians, strong advocates like everyone at this table who really want to see that stuff built, there's a counterweight of landlords that do not want to see anything built. Because if nothing gets built, the value of their homes goes up. Because if nothing gets built, their rents continue to go up and up and up. And that's what they want. Ideally, we would be working with 4 levels of government: the feds, the province, municipal levels, and our indigenous governments who technically still have title to everything here. And we would be working to build things that work for people. We would be building housing as infrastructure. Okay, what do I mean by that? When we build roads and we build water pipes, there isn't an owner at the end of that saying, well, how much money can I build from people for these things? The roads are for everyone. The water pipes, we've got to pay a little fee, but again, they're set up so that everyone has water. This is how we used to do housing. We used to just make sure that there were enough housing units for everyone. But we privatized them. And the result of that is the crisis you're living through today. It can be reversed. It will be reversed. It's going to continue to take organizing, but we're going to get there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jordy. I think you presented, you said you're going to present a number of challenges, but I think you presented an opportunity at the end there, which is taking back the control of housing. And one of the things we talk about at the pavilion is the Sustainable Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goal 17 is on partnerships. So we're here, a bunch of community people gathering, but how do we engage the governments, as Jordy was saying? How do we convince the private sector that they need to be part of the solution, not a counterweight, as Jordy said, to the problem right now? So next we'll move to MEP Utila, please.
Thank you so much, Alex. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all here. So for me, today, when I talk about housing, I want to talk about stability. Because on a very fundamental level, that's what housing gives us, right? It gives us this base that we can always come back to. It gives us a foundation to build our lives on. I believe housing is a human right. But you would be surprised to know that it's not enshrined as a human right by various governments, including here in Canada, in the province and nationally. But when we talk about housing as a human right, what we mean is that everybody deserves that foundation. Everybody deserves to have this basic stability in their lives and to build from it. I come from a public health background, and in public health, we say there is no health without housing. And so that means if you don't have housing, people are not going to be healthy, communities are not going to be healthy. So housing is that base, it's that foundation for stability and for health. If you look at the current housing situation in Toronto, and I would say across Ontario and Canada, what we see is the opposite of stability. We're seeing greater and greater instability, particularly in the rental market, because it's getting harder and harder for people to know and to live with security that they're going to be able to afford their homes year after year. We all know Toronto is one of the most expensive places in the country and in the world. Right now, if you want to buy a home, the average house sells for well over $1 million. It's one of the worst housing markets we've experienced in the last 4 or 5 decades. There are obviously many reasons for that. I'm not going to get into this, but what I want to say is that with the dream of home ownership being further and further away, what does it also mean? It also means we have more and more people renting. We are majority renters, particularly in large urban centers like Toronto. And what we also know is that given the instability and given the crisis, even in the rental housing market, more and more people are being priced out because rents continue to skyrocket. Rent has gone up an average of 54% over the past decade. 54%. Have wages gone up 54%? No, it's remained largely stagnant, right? And so what's happening is people are spending more and more of their paychecks towards rent. And more people are spending all of their paycheck towards rent. And more people do not earn enough to cover rent. And that is why we're seeing it also manifest in different ways, right? It's contributing to food insecurity. You may have seen recently in Ontario, we smashed a record, a terrible record, I would say. More than 1 million people in Ontario accessed a food bank in the past year. That was the big headline. When you look closely at why, it's because life is getting very expensive. You look further closely at some of the breakdown, you see one of the largest growths in people accessing food bank are working people. People who work for a living, who work full-time and still cannot afford to eat because housing is so expensive. So that level of instability makes it very difficult for people to build their lives. And we're seeing that also, as was mentioned, with more and more encampments in the city, everywhere, right? In Toronto alone, and this is the data from a couple years ago, there were over 10,000 unhoused people. I think we can say that that's definitely grown. And that is obviously a very, it's one of the worst possible ways in which we can see that the housing is not working. And there are many, many challenges to it, of course. When it comes to homelessness, it's a complex problem. We are going to need multi-pronged approaches to solve it. But what we also have to keep in mind is, as Jordy mentioned, governments need to get back into the business of building housing. Because the private sector will never build the kind of housing that is the diversity of housing. When it comes to supportive housing, when it comes to social community housing, co-ops. And you know what? The private market, the builders themselves say that. They say, that's not our job to build. So then whose is it? It's the government. And so there is really an important role for all levels of government to play here. But today we're focused on renters. So I do want to talk about more exclusively about renters and some of the policies that we're working on in order to bring changes to provide that stability. So when it comes to rental laws, obviously the province has a very big role to play. So I'm going to be focused on provincial policies. We're in Toronto. I represent a riding in Toronto, so a lot of the examples and things like that I share will be of people living in the city, in urban centers. And of course, let me say that there's so much that needs to be done in order to ensure fairness in the rental market. But the two big things that I've been focusing on when it comes to stabilizing to ensure that it remains affordable for people is to ensure we have effective rent control. So we all know what is rent control. Is a measure in which we can prevent rent gouging to stop it from increasing exorbitantly with unpredictable amounts. And so rent control is preventing this unpredictable increases. But when we have rent control, it's set. There's a guideline and it increases as per the guidelines. In theory, now I say in theory because there are massive loopholes, right? So one of the loopholes that we have is something called vacancy decontrol. What does vacancy decontrol mean? It basically means that when a tenant leaves a unit, when the unit is vacated, rent control laws do not apply anymore. That rent, that unit can be rented for whatever amount that the landlord wishes. So you can see sometimes rents jump $500, $600, $700 more, double, depending on how long the previous tenant was there. You see that massive jump because rent control laws do not apply when the unit is vacated. That's one major loophole that we need to close. And I've tabled a bill. It's called the Rent Stabilization Act. And it basically says that the new tenant pays what the old tenant pays, right? The rent should be tied to the unit. And of course, allowing for the guideline increases that is set out each year. Another major loophole that exists is the 2018 rule, which exempts basically all units that were built after 2018 from rent control laws. So even if we talk about increasing rental supply and if all of that happens, which is not happening right now, but even if it happens, all those units are not rent controlled, which means it can increase by exorbitant amounts, unpredictable amounts every year. Now, why 2018? Yes, this is another date to add, to remember. 2018 is the year we had an election in Ontario. And the current government came into power. And one of the first things they did was to roll back rent control laws. And 2018 onwards, the new bills were not covered under rent control. Jordy shared, but I was also going to point out the example that we saw with the two sisters, whose rent increased by $7,500. And very important to note that this was in retaliation to maintenance requests. There's a huge power imbalance there when we don't have rent control, right? The other example that I wanted to share was from my own community in Parkville High Park. In High Park, there are many new builds, rentless. They're called Live More Hyde Park buildings. And the tenants in those buildings have been facing massive rent increases every year, as high as 17% a year. So last year, 550 tenants in these handful of buildings got together and said, this is not fair, wrote a letter and submitted it to their landlord, the corporate landlord, GWL Realty, and basically said, stop these sky-high rent increases. These are new builds. What is the reason for it to increase? There is no new maintenance things happening, right? And it was increasing simply because they're allowed to. And if you think about that, just a few buildings, 550 tenants who signed that letter in one neighborhood. Now think about that in neighborhoods across the city, in neighborhoods across the province, right? We're talking about massive number of people who are experiencing this and who don't have that stability in their lives because of lack of rent control. The other thing I wanted to point out, and you may have seen recent reports, in the Globe and Mail, there was an article which shed some light on these double-digit rent increases. And it turns out it may not be as random as we thought. So there is this American AI software. Does anybody know about it? Have you heard about it? All right, I see one hand there. It's called YieldStar, okay? And it's being used by a number of large corporate landlords in Canada. And what it's doing is basically enabling these corporate landlords to coordinate. So essentially the way it works is these corporations, they put in some, confidential data into the system, and this software, does its algorithm thing and spits out a number to increase the rent by. And that has led to massive rent increases. Now, interestingly, this comes from the United States. And there, the American corporate landlords are on record saying that because of the use of their software, they were able to overcharge for rents. This software, YieldStar, is currently the subject of dozens of federal lawsuits in the US that is brought forward by the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice, in their argument, says, and I'm saying this in quotes because it's their words, not mine, it enables illegal collusion, right? So is it happening here? We don't know. At the very least, we need to investigate, right? So the Federal Competition Bureau needs to investigate to see if something similar is happening in Canada. And if so, pursue all appropriate remedies. It is really, really important that we get to the bottom of this and prevent the kind of rent gouging that is predatory. And the irony is, the reason why I'm also sharing this is connecting it back to rent control. Because when the Conservatives rolled back, the current government rolled back rent control, we said it was because it was inhibiting the free market, right? But as we can see, in the absence of rent control, what is essentially happening, what is looking like it's happening is enabling the subversion of the market. If this 2018 rule was not in place, this software would be irrelevant. You would have guidelines that would have to be followed. You wouldn't need this kind of use of the software to do the algorithms for everyone. So, as long as we don't have proper rent control laws where these loopholes are fixed, tenants will not have the stability and the predictability that everyone deserves. We know that, and no one can live and build a life not knowing what the single biggest cost is going to be year over year. And if you speak to the free market people and conservatives and, actually anybody, like nobody expects businesses to not have some kind of predictability in the long run, right? So why is it that we take away that predictability from renters and tenants on something so important and fundamental like housing? This is why people are being pushed out of the city. And then, you know what? As we're seeing now, it's no longer a Toronto issue. This problem is across the province. Obviously, more and more towns closer to Toronto are experiencing similar problems that we saw a few years ago. It's everywhere, it's spreading. And so I think at the end, what we really need to do is to make sure that we close these loopholes. And one of the reasons why I also want to bring these two examples, and very specifically the 2018 rule, is that in the coming months, this bill at the provincial legislature here in Ontario is going to be debated and voted on. I've tabled this bill, but I'm going to be bringing it forward to debate and vote. Again, it's a very simple proposal, my bill. It basically says, get rid of this 2018 rule. Just make sure that all tenants, regardless of what year the building was built, is protected under rent control, like it used to be, right? This bill was debated and voted on before the last election. It was voted down. And here we are now trying again. Now, this is the policy change that has to happen. We're not giving up. We need to continue to organize, and we will keep bringing it back for debate and vote again and again and again until it passes. We're not going to give up. Just in terms of timeline, if folks are interested, it's probably going to happen towards the end of the year in December. So keep your eyes posted. And I will end with a call to action. All of you are represented by somebody in the provincial legislature. Please contact your member of provincial parliament. Talk about, housing, our discussion today, and urge that your representative, your MPP, votes in favor of getting rid of this 2018 rule and ensures that everybody has rent control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pitila. And this is very important. We're not just here to have a discussion and share some doom and gloom and talk about the challenges, but we're here to take action. What can we do as a community, as a group, to impact change within our communities? And Pitila outlined something very clear. And again, this connects back to housing as a right. What Jordy was saying, if you control that supply, we can really rebalance the power between the two groups here. And with that, we will have our last speaker before we move to discussion. Jocelyn, who will discuss rental communities as collaborative spaces. Jocelyn, please.
Yeah.
What's your bill number for the building?
No, bill number. You'll take. Sorry, I think it's 22.
There have been so many versions of the bill. I have forgotten the number. I believe it's Bill 40, but let me just confirm. Bill 48, rent control for all tenants.
Okay, it's turning into a very interesting conversation. Thanks for everyone. I know everyone is kind of busy and we had to hold this session in the middle of the day. We appreciate your presence here and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to collaborate with us on this very important issue. I'm now gonna take us for a little bit of blue skying. Like, how can we make this better? How can we, as a community, work collaboratively and improve our situation as renters, as tenants, you know, being more aware of our rights and see where it takes us. So before I start, you know, I'm Jocelyn, president of Hyde Park Tenants Association. I work closely with Alex. He's our VP for HPTA and deals with a lot of above guideline increases. The HPTA is a volunteer-run group. We just pretty much advocate for members around enforcement of rent control, repairs, and maintenance in the community. So if you happen to be familiar with our little block there around Hyde Park and Bloor, there's about, I think, like 3,000 tenants under our membership. And our association is actually in the riding of MPP Batila. So our vision is simple, like we just want to support and advocate for our members. You know, we fight for AGI. For those that are not familiar what AGI means, it's basically going above and beyond what the provinces approve rent increases. So for instance, you know, your landlord says across the board provincially, they'll say a landlord can increase your rent around 2.5, but then landlord says, wait up, I need 3% more. So you know, you're up on the hook for 5.5%. So we as an association negotiate that on behalf of our tenant members at the LTV. So our mission is just to help sustain the high quality of life and the affordability for our members. You know, Hyde Park seems to be a community that is have this huge chasm of, you know, have and have nots. People have this impression like, oh, I live on Hyde Park Avenue. Ooh, you live in the mansions. Actually, you live in the apartment buildings. And don't go in there because there's some buildings, you know, they're not decrepit, but they're also not well maintained. And so this is where we come in and we say, you know, how can we make this better for our members? So point of view, what is going on right now, you know, it's very traditional relationship between the landlord and the tenant. You know, you focus on the leases, the rents, the contract, it's all transactional, right? There's limited tenant engagement. You know, for us that live in, like, I've been a homeowner for decades and we decided to downsize. So I ended up renting until we figure out what we want to do. The most engagement I had coming into a rental situation was me asking the landlord, is there a space available? How much is it? I signed the lease, they give me the keys, and voila, that's it, right? Once you're moved in, the other situation you deal with is your neighbors. I've been in my unit for like 5 years, I think. I only know one neighbor in my hallway, and I'm kind of like active in the community, so I could only imagine people that have not really engaged with their neighbors. So we're battling this isolation. You know, there's an isolated living experience, which pretty much reflects and ties into the recent report of like loneliness is already an epidemic in Toronto. So coming into this and thinking about collaborative ecosystems, there's new possibilities, you know, like let's bring it to our side. How would everyone feel if we're like stakeholders? You know, when stakeholders are like, we have a fair amount of interest into where we are, not just like living there for the sake of having housing. Like we care for our community, we care for, you know, our union, we take care of it like as if we own them, right? There's also that avenue of shared goals and interests. So I'm not sure if you guys have even connected with your landlords. Have you had an opportunity to talk to them? And not talk to them because there's a leak or there's like a safety issue or the elevators are not running. You know, like really talk to them and see where they're at. Like, how can we make this a better place? I always say, we live in the apartment complexes. Our landlords are employees, right? They come in there for the day, they do their work. At the end of the day, they're done. Meanwhile, we have to deal with the situation, the challenges that we have. So I always wonder, like, how do we as tenants actually make it more personal, if you may say, or more like just have the collaboration, the feeling of working together and maintaining our homes. And of course, the third one is a thriving ecosystem. Because you'd be surprised, there is an existing ecosystem in living conditions within apartment buildings specifically. You have like small kids needing daycare. There's no daycare spaces in the city, which is another challenge. You'd be surprised that like the grandma down the hall is more than willing to take care of the kids while you go to work, right? There's extra food in the fridge from someone in the building. Meanwhile, someone couldn't afford food. Drawing back on what Matilda said, on 100 million folks reach out to food bank, right? There's a lot of possibilities wherein we can make our communities more livable and more collaborative. So why collaboration matters? It builds stronger communities. Remember when we were in lockdown, when we barely saw anyone? I moved into our current apartment building in November 2020. I've not seen a soul when I moved in. There's no opportunities to, you know, learn about your neighbor or even find out where's the garbage chute. Because everything was done remotely and we just kind of like fend for ourselves. So I was thinking there's got to be a better way to establish, you know, connections with your neighbors. And that prompted me to start a Facebook group and just involve everyone, invite everyone. And I finally got sucked into High Park Tenants Association. No, kidding aside. So there's you know, there's room for building that stronger community. Improve tenant satisfaction. I have to put that in there because if you notice, the corporate landlords have this Google reviews, right? Has anyone answered any of those Google reviews? You know, when you put in a ticket and say, I have a chip on like a countertop, and then someone from management comes in, fixes it, and they'll report back and say, the service has been done. Can you rate our workers, right? And that was like, I kind of had to pause myself on that and reflect, because I think it's a good way for us to actually provide appreciation when it's needed and when it's afforded. But at the same time, it felt like very transactional, right? But we use it. We use it to provide feedback. We use it to inform our landlords, you know, whereabouts their service is lacking or when staff did a phenomenal job. And lastly, the benefits for collaboration is it builds social capital, right? Like, you know, your neighbors, you don't get locked out. Sometimes someone tries to finagle themselves into the building without they lost their phone. If you knew your neighbor, there wouldn't be any hesitancy to bring people in, but because you don't know them, you just leave them out, right? But things like that kind of helps you make the environment, the living conditions more friendly, more in touch with the community. So there's global examples, and I was looking at this last night on how we can make our housing better here in Canada. This is because, like I said, it's always been transactional, and there's this huge gap between supply and demand, as you've heard from Jordy and Gatilla, and there are actually quite creative ways to address homelessness and the lack of supply. So I've just kind of like selected the three highest that came up in my search. And there was one that said the co-housing in Denmark. Co-housing in Denmark started like as early as the 80s. And so they provided like opportunities for folks to come together and live together in a single dwelling, whatever that may look like, right? It might be multi-generational tenancy, or, you know, split amongst friends, family, whatever that looks like. You do have a little bit of that happening here in Toronto, but unfortunately, it's almost like it looks like rooming houses, right? Not actual homes that people share and own together. And then there's the eco villages in Germany. So all of these are not just happening, you know, because folks decided, oh, we're going to come together and live together. There's a lot of policy that comes from government that supports these types of housing. And then the shared spaces in New York, again, like, you know, this has been kind of like trickling down in Toronto as well. But again, not enough spaces for us to share. And there's talk, I could be wrong, there's talk around how to develop the empty spaces downtown central, because folks are working from home, right? Leases are up, corporate is not renewing them. So people are trying to visualize and see if there's any opportunity for us to convert these towers, office towers, into actual residential dwellings. So shifting mindset from tenants to stakeholders it's kind of big leap, because we come in as renters and we think like, okay, this is only what my lease says I can or cannot do. A perfect example of this too is like tenants tend to not report on issues in their dwellings because they fear, you know, oh, the landlord's gonna target me, I'm causing trouble, I'm gonna get evicted because I reported this, or I'm demanding too much work to get done in my unit. Actually, if we switch our perspective into really owning our space and saying, wait a minute, I actually pay for my space, so I have every right to enjoy it. I have every right to be serviced for the things that fall apart as per my tenancy agreement. I shouldn't be afraid that I get targeted, right? But because there's so much lack of housing supply, people just tend to keep to themselves and not bother the landlord. So we really need to educate ourselves on our rights and be very vocal about what our needs are. Shared ownership of community well-being. Like I said earlier, apartment dwelling, there's common areas. But we as tenants are not somewhat exempted from keeping our spaces clean and safe, right? I just cringe when I have like a neighbor that just leaves a tissue paper down on the elevator. And I'm like, okay, there's no pride in the home, right? We have to remember as tenants, as good neighbors, that we need to have the sense of pride in our home, our sense of security in our homes. And that is shared amongst our neighbors. Like our dwellings do not end within our four walls. So we need to be able to, be mindful and be, I guess, more so like responsible, right? And of course, there's increased engagement. So when I'm thinking of increased engagement, it's positioning yourself as not just a quote unquote tenant, not just a client of the landlord, but truly a partner, where you're living. We have a few buildings, partner buildings in the community. They have like community gardens, they have like drives for clearing out old clothes to donate. Like there's a lot of community building activities. And I think this is what we're missing, and it stems from not being engaged with the community. So how to build a collaborative space to create opportunities for open communication. Again, to my point earlier, like you have to be able to strike that conversation with not just your neighbors, but also with your landlord. And give your 2 cents into like how they can help you make the dwellings better, safer, and more secure. Establish shared goals, and believe it or not, promoting joint initiatives. We had a quite a span of vacant lots in our community wherein we can have like farmers markets during the summer. We invite folks from the our renters all across the members, all across the different buildings to participate. And that helps us get to know our members and also helps us support our small business owners that live in our dwellings in our as our neighbors. There's so much potential. I'm so sorry. Okay. Tenants and landlords as partners is a shared responsibility. Co-create community rules, joint investment in the quality of life. And then there's the long-term tenant retention, which is very important. To a few points that were raised earlier, there's this tendency to just turn around units, put on a slab of paint, and then increase the rent. Like we need to be able to make sure that we as a collective have a voice in this. And I think with Attila's bill, that would address all of these issues. Okay, tackling barriers to collaboration. I don't know how much more I can kind of like talk about, the importance of it, but there's different priorities for different stakeholders. So our priorities as tenants are clearly different with the priorities of our landlords or our neighbors, but we can always kind of like put like sorry, I got distracted by that. We need to have like this clear list of our needs, what we can also provide and share with the other stakeholders. We need to strike a balance between what our needs are and what our collective community needs. And how can we address the issues and avoid conflicts, right? Because we tend to like come from a place of defense, like I'm a tenant, I'm all for this is my rights. And of course, the landlord lashes back, like I'm a landlord, this is what you can, this is what your lease agreement speaks of. Like, it would be a very good place to be in a very collaborative sphere if both can come together and work together and just kind of like come to a place of coexisting civilly. The future of rental communities, there's so much we can do, right? We can have so much mutual aid and shared prosperity, because let's face it, if we are good tenants, if we take care of the space we're in, there's no reason for the landlord to do the same. And then we develop this neighborly relationships. And the tendency is you don't want to move. You want to have roots in where you are. And that builds community. And you as a collective within the, whatever apartment complex, whatever spot in the community you belong to, can make a difference, can have an impact. You can all come together collectively, create meaningful projects. It just speaks a lot to community building, right? And I think this is a missed opportunity because we tend to like focus on the immediate, like what is the issues, but we forget that the immediate issues, once we address them, can actually lead to better opportunities in the future. So that's it for me. Thank you. Apologies for the ringing.
No, thank you so much, Jocelyn. So today we heard we went through our meeting today. We had a very global perspective. We heard from a network of associations. We heard from the government, and then we heard from an association that's dealing with tenants on the ground as well. And again, this is about action. What can we do collectively as a group to shape the way our communities grow as well? And Jocelyn touches on a very important point about seeing our homes as homes, right? We're not living in a landlord's building, but we're living in our homes, which I think is an important discussion topic. So we are at the end of our time, and maybe I know we promised discussion. Are we okay for maybe 10 minutes, maybe one comment? Question? Sure, I see, well, I guess my friend here, Waleed. Waleed, please, maybe I'll ask you to come and use the microphone. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Jocelyn, and Patella and Glory for that amazing presentation. And welcome to Regent Park, everyone. So my name is Waleed Kogali Ali, and with the Regent Park Neighborhood Association. I love the way you spoke about community, and I want you all to write this down, go Google this, the Regent Park Social Development Plan. This wonderful display, the pavilion, tells a story of how we are building community. And we're building that community by making sure the investments in our neighborhood. Residents of Regent Park were able to secure $2.5 billion to resource the Regent Park Social Development Plan. And we were able to secure $26.8 million in community benefits for the next decade to ensure that investments are made in a targeted way to support our youth, our seniors, that make sure there's a focus on community building, on safety, on communications and employment and economic development. And I have the pleasure of being the resident co-chair of the Community Benefits Oversight Working Group to make that happen. I just want to make sure that we reflect on a couple of things before we leave today. One, we all know our cities are creatures of the province. So the province sets the tone. And there is one bill called Bill 134. Write that down, Bill 134, that defines the affordability of housing. And what we've done in the city of Toronto is petition our local government to make sure that we have a definition that's based on income. So look up OPA 558. OPA 558, and look at Bill 134. The other thing that I want to point to is Bill 185. Bill 185 just got passed this year, and I know MPP Batilla knows about it. It actually prevents third-party appeals and also kills existing appeals. And it actually empowers developers and disempowers communities. And because of that, we have less tools in our box to secure affordable housing. So you want to know that as well. And just like the Parkville Residents Association, the Regent Park Neighborhood Association is a proud member of FOSTA. And we actually and I'm glad, thank you, Alex, for putting this up. This is an infographic. We actually made a submission to the Standing Committee on Heritage, Infrastructure, and Cultural Policy. Sorry, I have to read that out. Sometimes I forget these acronyms. But we were very concerned about that definition of affordable housing that didn't address the current conditions created by the economic crisis born out of the pandemic, if not other factors. And we made a very specific submission that we want, although we actually said the City of Toronto's current definition of affordable rent based on 30% of household incomes between the 30th and 60.7 is more humane, but still requires careful reevaluation. And this sort of infographic speaks to that. There's a lot of folks that have been left out. They've actually been left out if this definition that was approved provincially and applies municipally is applied. And when we ask the government to make those changes to capture more residents. Now, I want to point out that we have a federal national housing strategy. And the national housing strategy does speak to housing being a basic human right. You can Google this up, it's all there, right? The government, Prime Minister Trudeau and his government always speaks to, well, we believe housing is a basic human right. Well, that means it's critically important for our federal government to align with our provincial government and our municipal government to make sure there's one definition of affordability when it comes to housing. And that's based on income, that which captures most renters as well as homeowners. Last thing I'm going to say before I pass on the mic is, in Regent Park, we learned a lot. In phases 1 to 3, we had 17 residents who lived in social housing, so Toronto community housing, that were able to purchase homes. And they were able to do so due to funding made available not just by the municipal government, but by the provincial and federal government. So 2 programs, one being called Boost, the other one called Foundation. It was a really cool program. Back then, all you had to do was put a 5% down payment, pay about $680 a month in mortgage, and commit to living in your community for 20 years. And guess what? There was a debt forgiveness clause. Take that in. So whatever you owed after 20 years was forgiven. And that's because we have a lot of Muslims and a lot of folks in our communities who didn't want to pay interest because it's haram. So, when we negotiated with our elected officials to make that a reality. So 17 families benefited. But there was over 230 other families that benefited. Many of them never lived in social housing. Many of them were connected to the developers or to our elected officials. So they actually benefited from the speculation in the market between 2011 and now. Now they're living in homes worth $1.2 million. So if you basically made that purchase in 2011 or 2010 and sat in the washroom for 5 years, you'd be a millionaire in 5 years. Right? This is the conditions we're living in right now. So I want to challenge you to ask the important questions about Bill 134, Bill 185, look up OPA 558, look up the National Housing Strategy, look at the funding that's coming to our communities, and demand better by making sure there's investments made in our communities through social development plans like the one I referenced earlier. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you, Wally. So just because the rules are the rules doesn't mean they can't be changed. But that's what I'm hearing. I do see that we have an individual Maybe we'll take two questions, if that's okay with our panel here. Two more? Yeah, okay. So Kate, I see that your hand is up in the virtual world. I turn to you. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. Am I unmuted? I guess I am. The people who are often forgotten when we're talking about affordability are the people that need accessibility as well. So it's a real dilemma for people with disabilities and for seniors like me who cannot find a place to live that's accessible with a walker or a wheelchair. And Stats Canada says 28% of people in Ontario have a disability, and that doesn't include most seniors, and it doesn't include people under 15. And there are a lot of families really struggling because they have children with severe disabilities. They desperately need accessible, affordable housing. So we need to change the Ontario Building Code to require that all new housing of every type be made fully accessible, be required to be accessible. And they've done this in Australia, so there's no reason why we can't do it here. And CMHC has reported that it costs the same to build a new apartment, whether it's accessible or not. So don't let any builder tell you it's too expensive. What's expensive is trying to renovate something that's already been built. So please remember all of us who need accessibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, very important point. Is your hand up? Yeah. Yes, please. I'll ask you to come to the front and maybe use the microphone and maybe share your name as well. And then I'm going to close conversation questions there, but perhaps we can discuss afterwards. We'll do one more. We'll do one more.
Hi, my name is Mihir. I have no stake in this other than just wanting a better city for us. But the question is more about the people who don't agree, right? Like, how do we reach people who see the world the way they do? Because my family and friends who are on that side, their perspective is more, this is my investment, this is my future, this is what I think is going to help my situation down the line. And they do not have this side. They don't have people who live in this situation. How do we reach those people? Because these bills, they're all great, but right now the government's not going to do what we want. So how do we get those people on board? So I think what it is.
I turn to the panel, perhaps.
Okay. I see how this goes. What do you think the number one issue, if you were to ask tenant advocates in Canada, is? I think it is. A couple of examples. Come on. Anyone? Affordability, engagement, maintenance of the buildings. Mike. The reality is actually, I don't think there is one. If you were to look across the country and go to the groups in Quebec, the groups in the prairies, the groups in the Maritimes, groups in Ontario, you're going to get totally different answers. And that's because there's no national or centralized tenant group in Canada. And that's kind of on purpose. I was at the International Union of Tenants Conference in Lisbon last year. And it's very different in Sweden, where they have a national tenant union. And not only is that national tenant union organized at every level, they actually negotiate rent increases nationally. Like the landlords sit at a table with the tenants and they hammer it out. We don't have something like that in Canada. And look, I earlier on mentioned the bad news. So believe it or not, I don't have a lot of despair around these things. Because I know that getting organized is hard, but once we are organized, once we are all pushing on the same levers, demanding the same things, once every single media interview always is a tenant advocate saying, this is what we should be doing, we gotta do it now. Once we kind of get to that stage, I think a lot of the power structures that are preventing this stuff start to crumble. But getting that stage, ask anyone, will tell you the same thing. It's hard. Getting everyone organized together and on the same page isn't easy. Advocates have been trying for decades, but it's doable. It's doable, and that's the thing that kind of we're pushing for. And that's kind of what gives me faith. Again, we're not very organized right now in Canada. We've got good organization in Toronto in some instances. They're very well organized in Quebec. Other provinces, I mean, go to Calgary, good God. It's a nightmare of tenant rights and services available. But I strongly believe that, again, if we can all get it together, and that's the hard part, again, things are gonna really change around here, right? Because again, back in the 1940s, they weren't just, taking over barracks in Ottawa, they were doing it in Vancouver too. It's a national push, and it got us over the line, and it'll happen.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a really great question because I think that all of us, right, whether you're a homeowner, whether you're a renter, depending on what kind of building you, we all, I believe, have, this desire in our heart to make sure that Toronto is a city for everyone. As people, I'm talking about, okay, as people, humans. Like, and so the question I always ask folks is, what kind of Toronto do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a Toronto where artists can't afford to live? Do you want to live in a Toronto where, families, particularly newcomer immigrant families, can't afford to live? Like, is that your idea of the city? Right? And so this vision that we have for like, who's Toronto for and who gets to live here? I mean, more often than not, everybody thinks that Toronto's for everyone. Like, whoever wants to come and live here, you can make Toronto your home. But how do we get there is the question, right? And for us as, people who live in the city, particularly, this is what I always share especially when I speak to tenants, is you have to keep talking. Talking to your neighbor, talking to, people in the building. That conversation is the start for organizing, is the start for community building. And so regardless of where a person is at the start, when you meet them, if you keep that conversation going, we can all work towards this vision of what kind of city we want to live in, right? And finally, I would say increasingly, we have to switch our thinking a little bit. And I think we have to stop caring about being right and care about getting it right, because at the end of the day, this is not it's not a theoretical war, I shouldn't say war, but like a battle, you know what I mean? It's not an ideological conversation. It's a very human conversation. It has like real consequences and impact people's lives, right? Like we're talking about housing without which people die on the streets. And so when we talk at that level, we are more motivated to get to the solutions and get there faster. Does that help? Yeah.
I always say you do what you can where you're at, right? And I feel for you because based on your question, this is not just affecting you as you are with your community, but there's family involved, right? Gotta love the family dynamics, man. I'm so sorry to hear that. However, if we do what we can where we are and just use our resources, right? Mobilization is key. Like in our tiny HPTA family, it's a lean group. And I always say, you got 2 hours in a month to donate and volunteer your time, your resources, your energy. I'm taking that. I'm not saying no to that, right? Because we can all contribute. We can all do beautiful things. We can make a difference in our community. We just need to be able to just have this conviction within. It's like, I really want this to make this right, Yeah, and not just for me, but for everyone, right? So start where you are and let's mobilize.
So I just want to add to the comments that were shared earlier about accessibility. Absolutely agree with that, especially when we're talking about future builds. I mean, there is no reason why new builds shouldn't already be accessible in addition to a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, if we think about housing as a human right, accessibility is a big part of it as well.
And I know we have one more question here, and it's actually someone who joined us very first in the meeting, so perhaps I'll ask you to come up. And then with that, we'll close the meeting as well. After your question.
I'll be here for your questions.
Hi, I'm just gonna give you a brief little bit about me and then ask my questions to everybody. I've lived in the same unit for 34 years. So we're in an older building which is under rent control. We're currently under renovation at the moment. In all that time, I've been working on building a tenant association. It comes and goes in terms of the people and the issues. Whenever we get delivered an AGI, suddenly everybody's interested. Problem is, over the years, more people have left, the rents are going up. Now with this latest thing, the landlord is threatening us old time, we call ourselves the old time tenants. We're all over 65, we're all queer, we're all single, and most of us are on fixed income, so we're a vulnerable group. So we get the letter from the landlord when we were using FMPA's literature to say, during the renovations, these are the things you need to do. You know, we want to work with you. They threaten us, oh, we got to speak to our lawyers, be careful. Now, the problem is, and this is where the question comes in, as a tenant group on fixed incomes, no, we don't have access to lawyers. We have nobody to give us advice. And the only time we might get something is once we're delivered, you know, a legal action, then we can go to neighborhood legal services or to get the paralegal and stuff. That's too late. Things are already happening. They've got a big corporation, because it's run by a property management company, not like a landlord and a tenant. It's a large investment company. They have all the power. We're doing what I can, we stay within the rules, but this is the problem we have when their rules are determined by political votes. So we're looking at potentially a conservative government coming in federally. We've got a majority conservative in the province who obviously tore up the last stuff that we had in the RTA. That was all torn up and thrown out. But doesn't, you can put forward bills, but you're still facing a majority. Our rights are political. It's up to who gets in. So it doesn't matter how much we want to do. So what I want to know from you guys is where's the legal help we have for people right here, right now, at the moment, who are being threatened by landlords, because they know they push us out, boom, up goes the rent. I face Allen Gardens. I got a beautiful view. Because I've been there 34 years, obviously I have reasonable rent. I get kicked out. Where do I go? There's no place for me that I could afford based on the income I have. But there's nobody to help us. So that's what I'd like to put forward and ask where we can find help, and it's usually legal in nature. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And so earlier I talked about vacancy control, if you remember it, where the rent control laws cease to exist once a unit is vacant. And as a consequence, what happens is long-term tenants, right? Their rents have been increasing at a slower pace because of guidelines, although we're now dealing with AGIs. It's a whole different issue. We're seeing huge abuse of AGIs. But there is greater incentive for landlords to kick out long-term tenants because then the rent jump on the unit is much higher, right? And that is why increasingly we're seeing these bad faith evictions, illegal evictions happening and on the rise. Now, speaking about the legal side of it, I mean, first of all, you have to keep in mind as well that at the same time, we're seeing rent control laws get rolled back. We're seeing the financialization of housing and all of that. What we're also seeing in parallel is legal support on the decline, right? Legal aid. So for example, in my community, we have Parkdale Community Legal Services, who not only provide actual lawyers to help fight, all kinds of cases, particularly in housing. There's also an advocacy aspect of it, where they do a lot of, organizing in the community, where they do advocacy work to push back on policy changes and things like that. And what happened is we also saw cut in funding to the advocacy side of it. If you look at who is even eligible to receive legal assistance, you see that the threshold has not changed at all. So if you are a working person, who just maybe barely affording rent or, just at the board threshold, the cutoff is, I think, somewhere around $23,000 a year. And there's lower than that, right? Maybe 20, I don't know, but it's really, really low. But basically, majority of the people who cannot afford lawyers and paralegals also don't qualify for legal aid. And so you're left in this limbo. And that is why more and more we're seeing rent strikes happening. Because tenants are saying, we're going to take these matters into our own hands. The system is not working to support us. The system is trying to kick us out. And so while I do know that we're living in a conservative majority right now that is not taking action, we have to keep organizing. And this is the thing, is that we can't wait for the right government to come into power, We have to keep that organizing happening. We have to be ready for that opportunity when that comes. And regardless of which party comes into power, we have to make sure that that happens. Because, for example, the 2018 rent control rollback, that was brought in by the Liberal government prior in 2017. And they brought it just before the elections, when they were very low in the polls and it looked like they might be losing. They had huge majorities. They were in government for 15 years. They didn't do anything about it then, right? So this is what I'm trying to say. Is like the organizing has to happen regardless of who's in power. And when you build that kind of community power and you build that kind of tenant power, then you're really able to have a much stronger, say, or able to push government policy in the way that actually supports tenants.
Just add shortly to say, the short answer to your question, who's going to help? I don't know. There's sometimes services that are available, but sometimes not. So if you're ever looking for services, who might be able to help, you can always call our hotline and we will try to triage you. Sometimes we're successful. Sometimes we'll be able to connect to the legal aid clinic. Sometimes we'll be able to connect you to CCHR, some new service that will provide some legal support. Sometimes we'll try to connect you to summary advice through the Tenant Unity Council program. But I will tell you, sometimes there is no help. Sometimes you end up in a scenario where just the free resources that are available are so limited, it's bad. I don't want to, I don't want you to start there. So again, if any of you are having those issues, again, there are things you can do and there are things you can try. And we will help you try any and all of them if we can. But sometimes, again, the system fails people. Sometimes you need a lawyer for free, which isn't one. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to give up. It means there are other ways you might try to fight. But the other thing is I think our MVP has mentioned is sometimes we got to get those services back and try to expand. Thanks.
Just to add briefly, there's strength in numbers. So if you and your neighbors come together and feel that, help.
It's decreasing because our group is getting smaller and the other people are getting larger. They're not the ones being threatened by the landlord.
Right.
And since rent strikes illegal, as I say, I've been there 34 years and it only comes and goes with AGI. And the problem is that when the AGI comes, the landlord can be selective to whom they apply to. So all the new people that have moved in that already have higher rents, not gonna be applied to them, gonna be applied to us low people. So it's a numbers game. And the problem is the older we get, the less numbers we go.
No, that's true. And we're experiencing the same thing in our community.
Yeah, and it just becomes worse. So now that they're taking on the lawyers, so I work within the rules all the time. Try to work cooperatively, go to every LTV hearing, do all the stuff. They get their eyes on me. Because I've been there and I've been there and I've been there and I keep speaking up. And I try to be cooperative. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they want to get rid of me.
I'll take this conversation offline, you and I can talk, because I
And
have some ideas for you.
okay, it's just, I just wanted to say that all this stuff is great about the people, but there's people need help now.
Yes.
Like today, tomorrow, next week, about stuff. So, you know, there's lots of visionary things going on. Research, data, it's all great. But in the meantime, people are gonna still end up homeless, and once you're homeless. And you can't do advocacy once you're homeless.
I want to say younger people are organizing too. Acorn has tons of young members. I'm from Kitchener-Waterloo. We got university students, we got young people.
Yep.
We care about you as well when we
Yes.
organize for Acorn. We
Yes.
care about the seniors.
So I would like to bring this conversation to a close. We're about half an hour over. I'm going to turn to my colleague in the virtual world, Nanor. If you have any final comments, if you'd like to close us out, please do so.
Thank you for this very interesting discussion, Alex and colleagues. There, unfortunately, I couldn't join you in person today, but I mean, maybe one thing I would like to stress, which is something that I have been working on over the past years, is the power of data, of evidence, the importance of having data to provide an evidence base for for policy making, especially at the local level. This is something that often lacks. It lacks. Obviously, in many developing contexts that I have experience in, like in Lebanon, for example, there is no data on the number of households affected by rent control. I mean, just as an example, and I'm sure there is a lot of there are a lot of data gaps also in this case, in this context, and also more developed context. So this is one thing that I would like to stress, the importance of data and awareness raising. And I think, as you said, Alex, where change could happen is really, I think it's easier at the local level, at the neighborhood level even. Where different interests might come into conflict, but then at the end of the day, it's a smaller geographical scale. So it's much easier, I believe, to work at that local level. So yeah, I mean, I've seen this firsthand in other contexts, like from UN Habitat's experience in Lebanon after the Beirut port explosion, and us trying to devise some below market rate rent methodologies, and trying to negotiate some of these both with owners and tenants in a small neighborhood. These are some of the things that could happen only at that level. So maybe this is how I would like to end. To highlight the importance of data awareness raising, and also the importance of local level. Thank you again, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Nanor, and thank you to all our guests in person and in the virtual world, and to the panel as well. I thought that was a great discussion, and we're looking forward to some clear actions that we can do together. Thank you.